Hello and welcome to another episode of Pakistonomy. The last week has been a week filled with big news. You've had big interviews by Pakistan's Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi. You've had a huge interview or an interview that got a lot of coverage both within and outside Pakistan by Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan. Much of those interviews focused on the prospects in Afghanistan and what's going on there. And the dimming prospects of peace in Afghanistan have led to reports about ongoing negotiations between the Pakistanis and the United States related to access to bases, some level of military cooperation or counter-terror cooperation. And a lot of stuff is still up in the air. And so to understand what's going on, to hear what the predictions are, what the analysis says in terms of the prospects for Afghanistan, not only in 2021 as the American troops withdraw from the region, but beyond. We have with us Sameer Lalwani, who is a senior fellow and director of the South Asia program at the Stimson Center. Sameer is a dear friend and someone who's closely studied not only the war in Afghanistan and Pakistan, but the broader regional and strategic implications of what's going on in the South Asian region, or what has been going on in the South Asian region for a number of years. So Sameer, thank you for taking out the time today and welcome to Pakistonomy.
Thanks for having me, Uzair. I'm a longtime listener, big fan.
Thank you. Let's start with the top line, which is, we keep hearing or reading reports that one district after the another is falling in Afghanistan. Last count I remember reading just this morning is close to 50 districts in the last couple of months. I think last week it was 30. If the reports are correct, close to 50 have fallen since May alone. And the prospects for peace are really dimming. President Ashraf Ghani is coming to Washington, D.C. and meeting President Joe Biden on Friday. So how do you see things shaping up in Afghanistan, particularly as the United States withdraws from the country and what is, by most accounts, an accelerated withdrawal of troops from the country?
Yeah, well, that's the million-dollar question, I guess, these days. I think my conclusion is probably with most, which is that trends are poor. The Taliban is militarily effective. There was a really interesting net assessment that was done by a colleague, Jonathan Schroden, back in the beginning of this year. I've just taken a look at his assessments of, Taliban, how the Taliban stacks up against the ANSDF in terms of size, material resources, external support, force employment, cohesion. And overall, he sort of tips it to be slightly favorable towards the Taliban. And I think that's probably right. I think certainly the absence of an air force, or sort of the diminishment of an Afghan air force as the U.S. sort of operators and contractors pull out, is going to really, I think, tilt the balance. And I think there's lots of accounts talking about how the Taliban's emboldened, and that they're sort of, emboldened to sort of move on and sort of take more than maybe they even initially expected. There's kind of an argument in sort of the military operations where sometimes you move faster than you initially planned to. You sort of gain a momentum, which is both advantageous, but also sort of takes you further than you initially sort of anticipated. That leads to sometimes mistakes. It leads to mission creep. It leads to over exposure or overextension. But it does certainly appear that, from all avenues, the Taliban appears emboldened. But I think the logic for why this is going to play out as a civil war for a while is one that maybe is counterintuitive, because I think, we've been saying for 20 years that the Afghans are tired of war. And so exhaustion has to have set in at some point. And we've been saying this every year for the 20 years that war has either intensified or prolonged. And that's a fair argument to make. I do think people are exhausted, but I think war also sort of has an information dimension to it. And ultimately, some of the sort of the rationalist theorists of war would argue that what's happening in the war is that sort of both sides are seeking clarification on their balance of strength and capabilities and resolve. In the absence of clarity of that, parties are going to keep fighting because, once they sort of resolve that, the balance of capabilities and resolve, have sort of clarity about that, or sort of a mutual understanding of that, then that leads to bargaining in terms of political bargains and sort of a division of stakes. But absent that, you still have incentives to fight, sort of amidst sort of like that lack of information. And I always thought that despite the U.S. always talking about a hurting stalemate being on the horizon in Afghanistan, or sort of even present at times, that was sort of, I think, a theory of the Trump administration's escalation in 2017 was to achieve a hurting stalemate and then, try to sort of negotiate something. I don't think we ever achieved a level of hurt, sort of a mutual level of hurt on both sides. And I think now, by the United States removing itself from the equation, I think there's even more uncertainty about sort of the balance of capabilities and resolve that needs to sort of be sorted out, frankly, through fighting. So this is not it's not an endorsement of this, but it's sort of, I'm trying to sort of unpack the logic of why you can imagine the Taliban sort of feeling a need to continue fighting until they, achieve as much as they can on the battlefield, and then we'll negotiate the terms after that. I thought I'd just say one thing on the. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Really quickly on that. So from your point of view, given that uncertainty, do you then see that the Taliban basically in the summer and leading up to the winter continuing to escalate the war and going for what we would call some level of total victory, maybe sieging Kabul, or coming close to doing that in a way such that when there is more clarity, the political settlement as it would then stand would actually have to be heavily in favor of them and their position than it would be for Ashraf Ghani and the Afghan government in Kabul?
Yeah, and so this is where I'm at on a limb, because I haven't studied sort of the Taliban's, their inner logics and thinking of what their sort of their war aims and sort of peacetime aims are, other than sort of just what I've read on the surface. But I can't think of a logic as to why they would stop. I think is the sort of ultimate conclusion, right? So there are lots of logics that would sort of drive you to keep moving, especially if it's a permissive environment. If you're successful, if actors or adversaries are either conceding and folding or flipping to your side. There's a long history of during the Afghan civil wars in the 90s of major defections of sort of large swaths of parts of the Western Alliance and even the Northern Alliance. So I can't see a logic for why the Taliban stops unless they sort of hit a brick wall, and that might turn out to be if by some sort of miracle the ANSDF sort of summons a certain amount of steel. It could actually come about if external parties decide they don't want the Taliban to succeed, and they try to sort of put both sort of deny or constrain the Taliban while trying to also back either a mix of other parties or sort of some sort of unified set of militias in the Afghan government's forces. But yeah, ceteris paribus, I think the Taliban keeps moving.
So let's say that I agree with you that's what happened. I think anyone who believes in this perspective, I think even Prime Minister Imran Khan from Pakistan is mistaken. In his recent op-ed, he wrote about being partners in peace, which is a well-intentioned take from him. But he even seems to believe that at some level, the Taliban will agree to a political settlement. And my view, and I think you will agree with this, is that any insurgency that has fought for over 20 plus years, which feels that momentum is on its side, there is no aerial threat that can take it out, and the Afghan forces are retreating, if not flipping and surrendering to it, has no incentive to seek a political settlement because it is pursuing maximal gains on the ground through war. And I think that is what's playing out right now. And my fear, at least, is that through the summer and through the fall, the incentive to do that will increase for the Taliban, short of a re-involvement of the United States in the war again through air power. And they will try to, solidify their gains before winter sets in, and then maybe we'll see where the negotiations go. But that brings us to the regional powers, because they have a role to play here, and they all have certain things going around in terms of their influence or their interests with relation to what happens in Afghanistan. We've seen reports now confirmed by the Qataris that the Indians were meeting Taliban in Doha as well. So how do you see the role of regional powers in particular? Let's set Pakistan to the side here, because I want to come back to that at a deeper level. But you have countries like Iran, you have China, you have India, you have Russia. What role do you see them playing in this situation where frankly, the Taliban have all the incentive in the world to go for outright victory. Meanwhile, all of these powers would actually, at least from their statements, it seems that they would not want that to happen. So what role do they play here?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, like, I think your point about what there's no incentive for the Taliban to stop is similar to what I'm trying to say, is true, although it doesn't mean that there are no levers of influence over what the Taliban does, right? So one is in the realm of military pressure, of which the United States is sort of removing its application, but that's not to stop, that doesn't preclude other actors in the region from being able to apply military pressure or even at least remove military support, which is sort of, part of the Taliban's maybe even potential assessment of, what it's capable of is based on expectations of ongoing and future support or tacit support, let's say, from actors. I mean, there's, explicit evidence of this from Iran and Pakistan, but, there's even sort of a level of tacit support from Russia. And so if that was to disappear and if it was actually to turn into sort of some sort of, coercion, that could potentially change something. I think there are a lot of other actors that have the potential to shape the outcome a little bit. And then certainly on the economic side, when the United States has sort of conditions about, the removal of sanctions and financial sanctions and also the prospects for aid. And those are, coercive elements that could shape sort of Taliban choices. But if other regional parties were to share in that communication and say, we are also going to sort of deny economic support and sort of apply sanctions unless you stop at a certain ceasefire line and negotiate something like that. So those things I don't believe have come from any of the other regional compact parties that Imran Khan referred to in his Washington Post op-ed. And I think ultimately this is going to rely much more on them sort of deciding what they want to do. So there's two challenges, though, I think they have. The first is one of, what I call pivotal deterrence or pivotal compellence. There's a really good book on pivotal deterrence by a guy named Tim Crawford, who's a professor at BC. And incidentally, the Pakistan National Security Advisor, Moeed Yusuf, wrote a book drawing upon this theory of pivotal deterrence a lot for his own book on brokered bargaining in South Asia. But anyways, the point is simply that we've always had, I think for a lot of parties, we've always had a pivotal problem in Afghanistan, which is that you couldn't just coerce one side unidirectionally. You were trying to actively try to coerce both sides. And the United States oftentimes lost sight of this. We were oftentimes trying to coerce the Taliban and some of its backers, including Pakistan, while it kind of ignoring what was going on in Kabul and not applying sort of similar levels of pressure. So, but it's a very complicated and difficult prospect to pivot back and forth essentially between coercing and persuading two parties simultaneously. It's not as clean cut. So I think that's the same problem now that Iran and Pakistan and China and Russia will face, which is that they're both they have been boosters or bolstering the Taliban for an extended period of time, but now they're also trying to rein them in of sorts. And I think that's going to be a particular challenge for them to how they sort of pivot back and forth between sort of support while also even punishment or constraints. And then the second sort of problem layered on top of that is a coordination problem, because these actors have been able to sort of operate independently and, have sort of pockets of regional influence, but they had their own proxies and strongmen that they were backing and throughputs for commanding influence in the region and, really sort of foiling U.S. efforts. But now if they want to actually try to achieve a level of stability, they're probably going to have to coordinate a lot more actively than they previously have. So I think that notionally the proposal the Prime Minister Imran Khan put on the table is the right one, which is sort of this regional compact for intelligence sharing, but it's going to also require a coordination of conditioning of economic lifelines, potentially bolstering of the other side of the Afghan government, probably a mutual restraint from introducing heavy weapons that could tilt the balance pretty substantially one direction or the other, and probably communicating cohesively, which I think is absent right now. I mean, really, again, I'm not privy to all the details, but it does not seem like there is a sort of coherent set of voices from the region trying to do this. And largely this is because the region has been free riding on the United States for a very long time. Everyone was very comfortable with the United States sort of carrying the burden of responsibility, of leadership, and of military effort, and taking a back seat, and frankly, either prioritizing their own individual agendas, whether it was believing the United States or countering India or containing ETIM and the Uyghurs. But now I think the United States has basically made a choice for its own interest to thrust the problem back onto the regional actors and leaders. And I'll quote a colleague who wrote this about, several 2-3 years ago, basically argued the United States should stop solving security problems for those states that are eager to create problems for us. And if getting out of Afghanistan creates a few headaches for them, so much the better. And I think, to be frank, that's kind of what's happening right now.
I mean, that's, I would argue, would have been the right choice. And that was inherently where we were going. At least I thought where we were going sitting here in Washington when President Joe Biden said the troops are coming home, they're going to be out by September. It was even accelerated. But then we got the conversation going through leaks from the media that, wait a minute, we actually may want some bases in Pakistan or some level of kinetic, non-kinetic operational capabilities to be able to not only collect intelligence in Afghanistan, but conduct drone strikes or airstrikes as needed. And that to me at least seemed that, we're not fully keen on cutting the umbilical cord with Afghanistan and letting the region sort of deal with the problem of Afghanistan. And as you said, rightfully stop, allowing regional powers from free riding on us, on the United States. That hasn't, do you think that that's been the decision, or is there some level of confusion here in Washington as well in terms of what everyone wants to do? Because my view on this is, at some level, it seems like everyone is also worried about an ISIS-like scenario in Iraq, where the United States has withdrawn and ISIS is running roughshod over Iraq, and we have to get re-involved in the war. And this time they're trying to hedge that with some level of kinetic and non-kinetic capabilities to project power into Afghanistan. Do you think there's clarity in terms of what we actually want to do, or Washington wants to do related to Afghanistan?
Yeah, I mean, it has been dizzying for me to watch as well, and I can only speculate from the sidelines. So I'll offer a few hypotheses, right? So the first and obvious one is this is like bureaucratic, not necessarily turf wars, but different arms of the bureaucracy sort of fighting for their prerogatives and priorities, right? And so there's long been a CT, counterterrorism node within the Pentagon, within the CIA, within the intelligence community at large, within the State Department, that sees this acute threat coming from the potential reorganization and rebirth of a lot of transnational terrorist organizations within Afghanistan, and is saying we need to have a way to keep this down, and is searching for options of that, of which, bases outside of Afghanistan but in the region are a possibility. Now, I would argue, and I think many have, and probably the Biden administration is deeply aware of this, that essentially if you just sort of move your bases from Bagram to Pakistan or to Uzbekistan or something like that, you're kind of just transferring your problem to another area, but you're not really sort of getting yourself out of the real fix, which is that we've been fighting a losing war for a long time and will continue to do so at great cost to the American taxpayer. So I think there's sort of that challenge. It's possible that bureaucratic fight needs to be resolved. There's probably, I think, an element that you're pointing to, which is the political cost that every leader grows acutely sensitive to, which is that you don't want to have as they say, a Saigon moment on your hands or on your watch. And certainly the experience of ISIS overrunning what was seen to be as gains by the United States in Iraq was, I think, seemed to be a political setback. No one's really articulated what those political costs are. Maybe it looks bad for a little while, but it's not like it, cost Democrats it's unclear that it sort of actually cost.
I was going to say it didn't cost any seats in the midterms or any political support, right? It's not
this is where these things are really theoretical without, or they're notional without actually being empirically validated. I think this happens all the time. There's egg on your face because of a foreign policy blunder. Whereas on a daily basis, we've been suffering foreign policy blunders in Afghanistan, and somehow that political cost is not sort of borne in some way by the same administration. So yeah, I think that's another, but I think it's real, and it comes up in these moments where you sort of see a moment of sort of perceived stability, even though we knew for a fact, and I would argue this for a while, the cost of maintaining stability in Afghanistan was about to go up very rapidly, very high after the May 1st deadline. So it's an insurance premium that people like to describe our presence in Afghanistan as a cheap insurance plan, but it was a floating rate that was about to explode after May 1st. And so I think people are getting sensitive to that and looking for sort of alternatives. But then I think the third, there's an alternative theory out there, or sort of argument that I've heard, which is that, like, what if these leaks aren't coming from the United States? I mean, the United States might be going about trying to sort of figure this out, but it may not be quite as desperate as it seems. And there's a particular actor that keeps saying no, no, no very loudly. And it's conspicuous, right? Because if they're really concerned about the political cost of this, maybe they would sort of do this more in private rather than in public. But so I was wondering, like, at some point, is Pakistan really sort of driving this conversation, really drive the price up, or to sort of like structure the terms of it, of potential basing in a particular way? But I do think that, the prime minister has been so explicit and so vocal. He's effectively tied his hands. And maybe the purpose wasn't just to tie his hands from sort of any U.S. basing, but maybe it was to tie the Pakistan military's hands from being able to sort of set up an arrangement with the United States, as it did, in 2001, 2002, when it sort of set up terms of agreement for military access, overflight basing, and then drone basing in particular, which I think came to sort of really irritate the Pakistani political leadership, even though it was tacitly, if not actively, permitted by the Pakistani state.
Yeah, I think that the op-ed, the hashtag absolutely not in the Jonathan Swan interview, I think that those are all attempts to not only put a stake in the ground by the prime minister himself, but largely tie the military establishment closer to his position, from which to walk back from, the United States would have to offer a much higher price than what one would typically imagine, which is some level of counter-terror funds or military assistance, some level of IMF negotiation or ease of conditions from the IMF, right. And the FATF sort of decision that's about to come through. That's the standard sort of what's on the table, right? But then if you keep saying no, and this is a very sort of South Asian thing, right? You go into a market and the first thing the price is offered, you say no, and you walk out, and you expect the seller to come back to you into the street, and then bring you back into the store and give you a cup of tea and calm you down, so to speak, right? It seems like that sort of negotiation is playing out politically in real time in front of us. But really, from your point of view, like, how would you see Pakistan's role in this moving forward? They clearly, at least publicly on the civilian side, have been saying they want an Afghan-led, Afghan-owned process, an inclusive and democratic Afghanistan is in our interest. But then also at the same time, they don't really want to publicly, push the Taliban and condemn the fact that they've actually escalated violence in the last few months. So how do you assess, or how would you hypothesize the game or the role Pakistan is trying to play after, frankly, 2 decades of war where it has played both sides of the aisle?
Yeah, this is a good question. I mean, I think what's probably is happening is that Pakistan is in the process of updating its priors about what the incentive structures are among sort of different parties in the region. So I think my sense is that a lot of actors in the region were surprised by the Biden administration's decision. I think they all kind of counted on this recurring sort of lapse back into, but we can't withdraw completely, so we're going to stay there. And there's always been sort of an echo chamber in Washington arguing for that. And I think we just, the Pakistan, the Afghan government, maybe even China, I'm not sure. So, I'm not privy to what the thinking is in Russia and Tehran on this, but like, it seemed like they just assumed that the United States was going to continue to do this as we've done since 2012, every year, sort of kicking the can down the road because it was a political cost. And so I think they were genuinely surprised. And now they have a process of updating their assumptions and expectations. And one of them is that they have to come to terms with the fact that the United States is no longer going to be the actor in the region that cares most about this problem. I remember talking to a colleague at the State Department in 2017 who was saying, the problem with sort of this effort at whether you sort of go the route of escalate and then hope to sort of negotiate with the Taliban, or whether you just sort of suit, for a reconciliation process, is that the United States at that time was the only actor with a sense of urgency, and all the other actors were kind of, they wouldn't say blasé about it, but it didn't have the same sense of urgency, even though the costs were mostly being borne by them in the region. So I think now the equation is going to be very different. The United States is going to be less exposed, at least in the near term, and I would argue even in the long term, to the dynamics of what unfolds in Afghanistan, the spillover, the convulsions from a civil war, obviously the violence, the refugees, even terrorism risks, right? I mean, most of these terrorists are not going to be able to cross multiple continents to conduct a strike on the U.S. homeland. Most of them are going to be regionally oriented, and that should affect the region most. So I think there's going to be.
I would also say, especially they would, it's also just an incentive that you have defeated the United States and it has retreated. So the incentive to continue hitting an enemy that you have defeated also reduces from a radical point of view. And I think you would agree with this. The near enemy now is different because there's something going on in Western China that is far more antagonizing to Muslims and radical Muslims that are in that part of the world than what the United States may or may not be doing. Because guess what? The radicals defeated the United States in their worldview, right?
Right. Yeah, there are other fish to fry, I think. But yeah, it's not clear to me that Pakistan is updated, and not just Pakistan, but I think a lot of the actors in the region have updated their understanding of that problem now, right? So the bargaining over bases and stuff like that, like the United States probably wants them because it will mitigate some of the risks and the costs. If we could get it and I'm not even sure if it's like if the U.S. establishment would really go for this, because I think there are real costs that we know and headaches down the road with this. But if they could get something sort of relatively easy, accessible, cheap for some persistent ISR intelligence to surveil and sort of keep tabs on critical events, I think they would take it. But I also think that they're not going to pay a king's ransom for it like they might have 10, 20 years ago. And so that adjustment needs to take place. And then at the end of the day, the costs are going to be borne by Pakistan. I mean, it's funny, like when I read Imran Khan's op-ed, and even in his interview with Jonathan Swan, I didn't sense that sense of urgency, but in track 2 dialogues that I've been participating in with Pakistani strategists and really sort of like smart thinkers, I hear a continuous refrain about the fear of Taliban emboldenment, specifically Afghan Taliban emboldenment, and what that means for Pakistan. And I think it sort of could mean two things. One is just that they're less vulnerable to pressure or suggestion or influence, even though for a long time Pakistan believed that the Afghan Taliban would safeguard Pakistan's interests and its border interests, maybe the Duran line, stability there. And I have like some interesting quotes about this that I've been digging up from Pakistani military journals. But so I think there was a belief that that might start to erode now. But then the second is that actively or tacitly, there is evidence coming out that Pakistani scholars and analysts have written about recently that the TTP, which is a mortal foe of Pakistan, is going to have either sanctuary or support, again, tacitly or actively, from the Afghan Taliban. And so that's going to be that's a direct threat to Pakistan. So I think they're coming to terms with this. At the end of the day, the United States isn't going to go all out to safeguard Pakistan's interests against the TTP. That's ultimately a choice that Pakistan has to make. I think the proposition the United States might put on the table is, if we do some sort of forward basing here, we can help each other out. We can keep tabs on transnational threats as well as TTP threats that are of interest to you. And oh, by the way, remember who took out Baytullah Masood and Hakimullah Masood and sort of all the leadership of the TTP from 2009 to 2014, Mullah Nazir. So, there should be a mutual interest here, a mutual deal here. But I suspect that Pakistan thinks that it either is expecting more or maybe politically it's just untenable to do, and then they have to sort of find another alternative route for this.
And I think we're seeing some of the impact already, right? There's been an increase in terms of the attacks on Pakistani security forces along the Durand line, attacks in Balochistan, the Serena Hotel attack that was targeted towards the Chinese ambassador who was in Quetta at that time. All of that is, I think, in the last 6 months, the increase or the uptick in tempo signals that something is happening or something is changing. And I think from the Pakistani perspective, the concern is valid, right? That a victory or an outright victory or a resurgent Taliban in Afghanistan not only creates the pockets of support or sanctuary for groups like the TTP and Baloch militant groups, but also it emboldens the ideology that the Taliban and the TTP both are aligned on. And that ideology, you can't fence it out from the border, right? As much as you want to fence out the people coming back and forth. And so the risk is real, which brings me to my next question. And we've talked about this offline back and forth as well. But it seems like the risk of a ensuing civil war or a coming civil war in Afghanistan means that Pakistan will in many ways be drawn back into the world of geopolitics, which it publicly has been trying to push away from and embrace what is they're calling the pivot to geoeconomics. How do you see this supposed pivot, which is actually there in narrative format, but at some level actually is also playing out in terms of the policies the government is trying to push on the ground? Do you see this as some sort of meaningful, substantial pivot that the Pakistanis are doing? And overall, how do you rate its chances of success?
Yeah, I've been trying to understand this as well. That the term geoeconomics, and there's been some good writing on this of late, including Ambassador Malia Lodhi's piece in Dawn maybe a couple of weeks ago. And then I follow a lot of what Arif Rafiq writes on this as well as you, Uzair, because I think you all have sort of a really strong command of what's going on in the Pakistan economy. So I have a few thoughts. Like geoeconomics, I think traditionally and conceptually, and this I think what Ambassador Lodhi talks about is like it assumes you leverage economic power for political leverage and political consequences. And I think what really Pakistan is invoking is the inverse of that, right? It's trying to invoke some sort of political and security consequences that Pakistan contains or is present within to generate economic activity and economic engagement, investment, trade. And I think it's coming from a genuine place of Pakistan sort of taking stock and realizing that in the last 20 years, despite a lot of cash that came in, partially due to its relationship with the United States and the war on terrorism, it did not generate dynamic returns for Pakistan, standards of living, for economic growth, development, human capital development, and certainly, having effects on employment as well. So I think that's sort of like the general proposition. And I not only sympathetic to it, I think I support that idea. Pakistan has to play the hand it's dealt, and right now it's trying to sort of figure out like how it can leverage its geopolitical context to drive economic activity. But this is not. Let's be clear. This is not for just the sake of the fact that Pakistan's economy is rosy on its own. I mean, otherwise we just call it an economic strategy, right? This is clearly trying to leverage something political, and I think that it tends to it can be executed smartly, and it should be executed smartly better rather than how it was, I think, in 2001 when Pakistan, both sort of subject to both coercion but also, frankly, bribery, was offered sort of a deal of access and bases and collaboration and cooperation and intelligence sharing in exchange for a lot of money up front. I was looking at the numbers. I mean, while we talk about this figure of $30 billion dollars in the United States over the course of the war on terrorism over 2 decades, some of the early estimates I saw are that within the first 5 years, there was above board 10 billion transferred to Pakistan in terms of CSF, economic support funds, economic aid. But then on top of that, there was suspected to be a fair amount of cash that came from the intelligence agencies for like ransoms on particular Al-Qaeda targets and things like that. So it was estimated that it could have even been up to 20 billion within those first 5 years. That's a lot of money, but it doesn't seem like it was put to good use and didn't generate those dynamic returns. So Pakistan wants to sort of come up with a new strategy for how it generates greater economic interest and activity and flows, really. And I think the risk, though, Pakistan also has to be careful about, well, I think this is the right approach generally, is that it should not appear to be generating risk to extract rent, right? Because that can appear like a shakedown or like blackmail. And that would be, I think, to Pakistan's detriment. And if it did, it might still generate some short-term payouts, but probably long-term divestment. And I think its ability to sort of leverage that threat is far reduced now, because as I said, like the United States and Western exposure to this risk is also reducing, right? I mean, troops are coming out, NATO's pulling out. There are embassies there, but some embassies are pulling out as well. So it's not, you can't sort of leverage the same demands as you were able to when the US was at sort of peak troop levels of over 100,000, NATO's at 150,000 troops. And then there are alternative ways that the international community could push back if Pakistan tries to sort of take that shakedown approach, including economic sanctions and FATF has sort of, I think, been the most devastating for Pakistan relative to any other punitive measure the United States attempted. So So I think that, what this is going to require then for this to work is things that you've written about. It's like good old fashioned economic reforms, of which you sort of know far more about this than I. But, when I read, I think for Arv's piece, for example, I thought his point about, having to sort of decartelize certain industries in order to allow for sort of competitive industries that will then lead to exports and, foreign exchange and then sort of, more dynamic investment in the region. I think that's probably the path, but it's extremely difficult and uncomfortable. And it sort of goes up against not just strategic and military elites, but political elites' interests. And I think that sounds to me like it's unlikely. It requires tremendous political capital and courage. I don't know if that's going to happen anytime soon. But the expectation that the United States would find search for means for investment to put large sums of money into the Pakistan economy. And I've heard sort of various schemes about this, whether it's coming from back payments for CSF to the Development Finance Corporation to economic support funds again. I mean, I just don't see that happening. And we can talk about the role of Congress here, but I think that's just it's not even a reasonable ask because the administration can't say yes even if it wanted to. It's going to have to go through Congress for a lot of this stuff. So I think again that the framework and the paradigm is right, but most of the work is going to require Pakistan to sort of work internally on itself to make itself appealing, and then with the right partnerships, not through the Department of Defense of the United States, maybe through the State Department, but really we're talking about the Commerce Department, Development Finance Corporation, maybe USTR at some point, maybe Department of Energy for climate investments. Those are the targets for partners potentially, maybe cleared through the State Department for Pakistan. But it's not. I don't think it's going to be the Pentagon, and I think that's a huge adjustment shift from the last 20 years, and frankly, the last 70 years of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship that it's going to take some getting used to.
Yeah, I think in the near term, the hope would be that the $3 billion that they've put in as a line item as IMF budgetary support grants that are needed to sustain the budget, which in many ways is running contrary to what the agreement with the IMF is. So some level of easing where the IMF nods and winks and gives you that money at a low, to float the budget or to maintain the budget is what will be needed to have the growth. But again, will that be sustainable remains to be seen. And I agree with Arif in terms of, decartelizing the economy. You've seen that just in the last 2 weeks alone, where there were new taxes on the dairy industry, and they did a 1 week long campaign that ended with some senior level meetings, and the tax was then taken away. And if different cartels, different lobbies are able to do that in a way where the budgets and its numbers and the predicted numbers are, thrown out the window, right when the budget is stable, then it doesn't leave much confidence in terms of the overall capacity or the capability of the government to absorb the loss of political capital to make tough choices. And that is essentially the heart of the issue. And yes, that when you are unable to do that, then everything related to seeking investment from the United States or getting better terms from the IMF, et cetera, all become seen as shakedowns or blackmail, because you are not doing the hard work yourself, yet you expect concessionary financing to come into your economy to do what? Like maintain the status quo, which is extractive and rent seeking in essence, right? And that doesn't generate sustainable growth. So the cycle continues until the next round of negotiations come about. But within this thing, we're seeing in the broader region, right? Pakistan, China, obviously, CPEC has played a big role in terms of developing Pakistan's hard infrastructure. There's an emerging US-China rivalry that is leading to a US-India sort of deepening relationship. How do you see all of these things strategically playing out within the broader region and I'm guessing with the role or the evolving situation in Afghanistan sort of creating a perfect storm, so to speak, right? Just today, and this morning, you must have seen there was a bomb attack in Lahore, allegedly targeting Hafiz Saeed, the chief of the Lashkar-e-Taiba, his home. He wasn't there, or that's what they're saying. But essentially, it seems like some of this proxy war bombing, counter bombing type of stuff is back in vogue in the region. And all of this is happening within sort of this rivalry between the United States and China, deepening ties between US and India, Pakistan making a geoeconomics thing. How do you see all of this play out?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I always sort of disagree with is I'm not sure if it's back in vogue. I feel like this has been going on. We don't sometimes we sort of pay attention to the bigger activities, but I feel like there's been, spy wars going on for a long time. Sometimes there's violence that sort of comes with it, but certainly jockeying for position within Afghanistan for the last couple decades. I'd say maybe two things and then pivot back to something else that I wanted to say earlier about, geoeconomics, which is, I think you're going to see a fair amount of this, use of proxies and sort of shadow actors. There are a lot of them in Afghanistan. I remember, an Afghanistan expert, Michael Semple, making a comment at a conference maybe, 5 years or a decade ago, that there's, the Afghans are very good at pulling other sort of large actors into their wars. And this is sort of in response to a point that the United States or third parties should sort of get out of Afghanistan. Well, let's be honest, it's a game that two parties play, and there are Afghan actors that pull in support from external players as well.
Which, by the way, really quickly, before I lose my train of thought, is something like I recently reread Baburnama, the history of Babur, Emperor Babur, as he wrote it, and in terms of his view. And this was the same thing back then too. It was like these Uzbek lords and Mongol lords and the Persians coming in and going out as they please. So it's been part of the history, long-term history of that region in terms of how wars are fought and rivalries are dealt with.
I didn't even realize it extended that far. That's really incredible. But so I suspect that will continue. I think India, for a while, it always seemed to me that India had a play to make, which was the Taliban were bristling under the thumb of just the ISI, and so they wanted sort of external partnerships. They certainly got one with Iran, and I think that actually made Pakistan very concerned and frustrated about sort of these other patrons. I don't think India is ever going to be a patron of the Taliban, but like if it's a partner or sort of, works with some splinter groups or something like that, I wouldn't be surprised. I think Russia is going to cultivate some of its interests there as well. I'm not really sure where China is going. Typically it's defaulted to Pakistan, or not defaulted, but sort of deferred to Pakistan's guidance on this, and sort of their principal interest is safeguarding against Uyghur separatists that sort of activate in Xinjiang. But they might start to think they need to start take on more responsibility and activity, whether to safeguard CPEC investments, whether because of the Wakhan corridor becomes a point of entry that's of concern to them. So I think everyone's going to have to start to develop proxy strategies. It could get interacted with this idea of great power competition. I guess I wouldn't be surprised by that, but to be honest, I don't think the locus of great power competition is in Central Asia. We've tried to sort of talk about the Great Game for a long time, and there's potential for sort of like the new Silk Road or whatever, the Belt and Road. I don't think this is of great consequence, at least to the United States. So at least one actor, I think, is not going to play that hard. It might dabble a little bit from here and there, especially if it believes that it will sort of suck resources and divert, China and Russia's attention. All the better. But I remember talking to sort of a senior U.S. strategist, U.S. government strategist, whose argument was basically like, from the broad perspective, U.S. grand strategy, which warlord controls how many thousand square kilometers of territory in Afghanistan is of zero consequence to the United States. And I think that's largely right. So where is the competition going to take place? I mean, I think it's, we know it's in sort of Southeast Asia, South China Sea. And again, back to the geoeconomics points, this is sort of where you have the overlap of strategic interests, economic opportunity, where investors can see dynamic gains. So, the scope of the economies in Vietnam, Vietnam is sort of close to Pakistan's sort of total sort of size of its economy, but then Malaysia, Philippines, and Thailand are all bigger. Singapore as well, and then Indonesia is much bigger. So that's where I think the United States is sort of probably, if it's going to sort of put its thumb on the scale for political and strategic interests to drive sort of economic investments or infrastructure developments, that's where it's going to go. I don't think it's going to get concentrated in Pakistan. It doesn't mean that Pakistan's of no consequence. It certainly is, but less so than I think the Pakistanis have thought, or maybe less so than it has been over the last 2 decades.
I think some of us South Asian experts, including myself, are at times sort of, ignore to our mistake the role of Bangladesh in all of this, because I think it will have a much larger role to play as this rivalry heats up in the East, because it's got a dynamic economy. It's much more stable. It has played all sides of the aisle, or, with Japan, China, India, the United States to a certain level as well, because it's a big trade market for the Bangladeshis. And it has made the right investments, right? And I think we've seen some of that already, sort of some trailers of this coming out with the Chinese ambassador there talking about Bangladesh joining the Quad, which caught everyone by surprise, including the Bangladeshis, who were like, where did this come from? But clearly the Chinese seem to be worried, not worried about enough, but enough to sort of signal that they won't be happy if this were to happen. And I think we often forget that as this rivalry heats up, Bangladesh will play an important role. I don't know if you had thoughts about their strategy, but I see them as something that we need to pay attention to, because they're doing some interesting things as well.
That's a really good point. I mean, I think you're right. I've seen some of your writings and tweets about this, about just like the eclipsing the size of the Pakistan economy. This has been like, not just the size, but also GDP per capita, so wealth as well, which is, kind of astonishing in some ways, considering, the origins of Bangladesh. I think you're right that they have positioned themselves very carefully between some of these major powers. Frankly, that's I think fine for the United States. I mean, my sense is that the United States is not looking for a whole bunch of new allies, but rather for states to sort of remain diversified rather than beholden to a single country. And I think so the way that Bangladesh has done that with sort of its arms acquisitions, its infrastructure developments, its political ties, I think it's pretty well diversified, which positions it well. But then also, at least from sort of like a U.S. standpoint, is probably, in the United States interest as well. But yeah, that region is going to be really consequential. The Bay of Bengal is getting increasingly contested in the naval domain. I think, it's probably after the South China Sea, maybe, after the East China Sea and South China Sea, like it starts to become sort of one of these pivotal theaters of competition, and more so for India and China, if anything. I think the United States would be paying close attention to that. The one point where I would sort of quibble a little bit, and this is sort of, again, out of my lane, but from what I've heard, is that while the politics are stable now, there's a long history of sort of rivalry between the warring factions, warring begums, and there's not a clear line of succession after this. So after this sort of phase of politics in Bangladesh, what comes next? And that I think could sort of throw some wrinkles in there that I'm sure all parties need to be attentive to. What are the political relationships they have with with both parties, but also particular leaders? Is it going to remain dynastic in some way, or is it going to start to allow for sort of more internal democracy within some of these parties? But that'll be something that I think the United States certainly and China will pay attention to.
Yeah, and I think they'll also, I remember having this conversation before sort of Prime Minister Modi's visit to Dhaka about sort of radicalism in Bangladesh and Jamaat Islami being sort of, destroyed by Sheikh Hasina in many ways, but that Hifazat-e-Islam had sort of emerged as a counter force on the right. And people initially were, that I would speak to that kept an eye on this, were like dismissive that no, it's stable, etc. But then Prime Minister Modi came and we saw days of violence caused by Hifazat-e-Islam. And I think that's another, out of the succession point, there's also this point about the role of radical violence within the country. And can these two forces combine, the lack of a successor and political instability coupled with a right-wing movement that is more extreme than the Jamaat, but that has found itself filling the vacuum left by the Jamaat as it was targeted by Sheikh Hasina's government. And Sheikh Hasina has also tried to co-opt Hifazat in many ways. So I think that will be another important dynamic that the United States should pay attention to as well. I want to come back to Afghanistan before we conclude, and particularly focus on sort of President Ashraf Ghani coming here. What will you be watching for in this meeting, particularly as it comes on the back of some very terrible news, or at least pessimistic news coming out of Afghanistan in terms of the ability of the Afghan state to continue pushing back against Taliban? Like, what are some things that, obviously we're recording this before the trip. The podcast will go out the day after the trip. So some people may hold you to account on your predictions, but let's game this out, right? What are some things you will be watching out for from this trip?
Yeah. All right, so I guess I can sort of work it through this way. If I was Ashraf Ghani, what would I be asking for that's sort of within the realm of possibility? So I think sort of some sort of economic commitment and lifeline, which I think is the first thing, right? So continued support for the Afghan national security forces, and maybe, frankly, more than just sort of the security resources. I think the Afghan government needs to be able to have some flexibility if it wants to sort of buy loyalties of a bunch of other militias and warlords that are right now have a sort of common cause, but and seem to be sort of banding together, at least like, notionally, it seems like from some reporting. But I think in the long run, how do you sort of keep them all together as a coalition? So I imagine he would be asked for that. The U.S. has ruled out air support in battles with the Taliban, but I wonder if there's wiggle room that Ghani could try to sort of press for, like if there's nominally ISIS fighters in the area or Al Qaeda fighters in the area, and there's sort of intelligence that sort of says that there should be targeting of these particular actors that are maybe plotting something, and I think that's sort of where he's probably going to try to find some wiggle room if possible. I mean, I imagine it's a losing cause. I think the United States has learned its lesson of trying to sort of playing whack-a-mole with every potential Al Qaeda fighter that actually is just sort of rebranded from being a different brand of Taliban or sort of former other another disgruntled group. So I think that the U.S. is probably wary of committing to anything like that. But I imagine that's where Ghani would go. And then I think from the United States standpoint, what are they looking for? I mean, we're past the point of major reforms or any kind of like reforms, whether in terms of corruption or cleaning up the security forces or professionalization, but probably something that shows that Ghani is willing to maybe even set himself aside for the good of the country. I'm not sure if that's what the United States would ask for, but I think a willingness to say like a flexibility to devolve authorities and power and whatever it would take for the Afghan state to survive, a Taliban onslaught. And again, I even hesitate to say that because the question is, so for how long, and then what you get after that, you can have sort of another sort of diffusion of power to a number of warlords. It's going to a new headache down the road. Which also still could be vulnerable to Taliban offensive. So I don't really know what the United States asks at this point, but I can imagine Ashraf Ghani asks for support and try to sort of use the Najibullah mold as someone who can sort of hold on to power with external support and some cleverly crafted deals with various strongmen in the country.
Yeah, well, we'll see what comes out of this. I think like it is a dire situation there. And I think at some level, going back to where, the initial points you were making in terms of every side trying to figure out where the balance of power lies and what the dynamics are, I think the Taliban for sure will be watching closely at this trip and seeing what the United States offers and what Ashraf Ghani is able to walk away with, because I think that will then determine or inform their calculation in terms of their current momentum, how much further along do they need to push or do they want to push, and what's in store for Afghanistan. So I think this is an evolving story. I think all of us hope that there is peace and stability in Afghanistan. It's been a long, protracted war. But I think the realistic assessment is that there is a lot more pain around the corner than many of us would like. And we'll hope for the best. But before I let you go, this has been a fascinating conversation. You've already recommended a couple of books as you've sort of discussed with us, but I would like to conclude with your recommendations on books that have deeply influenced you or you would recommend to the audience.
Yeah, well, you made the mistake of warning me of this question, so I have way too many to recommend. Probably the result of having moved most of my office library to my home over the last year or so. But I guess, there's a couple that come to mind, two or three. Shaping Strategy by Risa Brooks is one of my favorite books. It really got me thinking about this dependent variable of strategic assessment. And in it, her sort of best studies, I think, are of actually Nasser's Egypt and Egypt under Nasser and then Sadat later, and how civil military relations affect strategic assessment and the quality of strategic assessment, of which part of that is military strategy and effectiveness, but it's sort of a broader strategic portfolio. But there are real implications and lessons to be drawn for South Asia as well. She has a mini shadow case study of Pakistan, but I think a lot of the idea of sort of civil military balance and how that affects those calculations apply to a lot of countries in South Asia, including India as well. Another book that was influential for me, so on my dissertation committee is Inadvertent Escalation by Barry Posen. And it was a book that sort of had poor timing because it was released in '91 at the end of the Cold War. And it was basically talking about sort of, how conventional escalation could lead to nuclear escalation by inadvertence, intentional acts that trigger unintentional effects that sort of draw nuclear strategic responses. But it's back, I'd say not just back in vogue, but it's actually being, it's a really useful template to understand some of the dynamics that are emerging between the United States and Russia, with China. For me, I've used it to sort of better understand some of the risks that can result from conventional conflicts or tiffs between India and Pakistan. So I think that's, again, a great work, really detailed and valuable methodology for thinking about escalation dynamics. And then I think, I figured I should throw in a book on Pakistan. I'm not sure if this is going to make people happy or disappointed, but for whatever reason, I always thought that Pakistan, a Hard Country by Anatol Lieven was a really, really well-written book, really accessible. I think maybe, maybe make some sort of, mistakes of essentialism, but for the most part, I think it gets a lot right in trying to understand the balance of states and societies. And there's this concept that Joel Migdal talks about weak states and strong societies. And I was reading that theory book by Migdal at the same time I was reading Anatol's book, and it really spoke to me. So I think that's a great read for anyone who's trying to sort of make sense of not just Pakistan, frankly, but South Asia writ large. And I'm gonna throw one more book in there just because I was literally reading this an hour before. But for us to understand, how the Taliban sort of might evolve and fight, and how the sort of civil war might play out, there's a new book by Steve Biddle out on non-state warfare, and I suspect it's going to be really good because his last book on military power was really excellent and also really formative in my approach to analysis. All right, so sorry I overloaded it.
No, those are great recommendations. You're the second guest to have recommended Pakistan, a Hard Country. It is a good book. It's something I read when I was doing my master's thesis research, and it is a good primer and a good sort of foundational text. And yes, I mean, I would be hard pressed to find any book that does not have its set of issues. I think that's why you read several different authors and try to find a way to understand what's going on anywhere from a theoretical or non-theoretical perspective. But I agree that this is a good book that anyone who wants to get started on understanding Pakistan better should read, including Pakistanis who may think that they know a lot about their own country and frankly may not, including the history of that country's relations with the United States. Sameer, thank you so much for taking out the time. This was a wonderful conversation. We'll all keep an eye out for the presidential visit to Washington, D.C., and hope for the best in Afghanistan, and maybe have you back again soon, maybe sometime around the fall, where we will have more clarity in terms of what the overall military gains look like for the Taliban in this season of fighting.
Well, then I'd have to account for all my mispredictions, but no, it'd be great to do that, and great to be on this with you, Uzair.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.